Okay, so I think we're just about ready to get started. So here we go. So this is the final. This is the final round table of the day, and in fact of the Independent Games Summit, and it's called, optimistically, Building the Future of Indie Games. And so I will just introduce the panelists briefly. So we have, starting closest to me, we have Derek Yu of Blot, and if anyone has read the conference program, seems to be called, his company seems to be called Bliss Blog for the purposes of the. I can only think that's a spell checker gone crazy. So
I think we're going to change the name of the company to that. Actually,
yeah, I actually like Bliss Blog, but yeah. So Derek's company Bliss Blog is behind Aquaria, which is the most nominated IGF game, and I actually showed it yesterday for anyone who was here yesterday. Next we have David Jaffe, only we don't actually have David Jaffe because unfortunately he can't make it. So we actually have, he does a Spider-Man style reveal. We have Eric Zimmerman, who you may have seen earlier from Gamelab, and he is standing in for Mr. Jaffe, who is unfortunately detained in San Diego. So I guess this is the point where I go, anyone who was waiting for David Jaffe, please leave now. Oh, he's not so popular as I thought. Excellent. So next up we have Greg Costikyan of Manifesto Games, who also has spoken on an earlier panel, and obviously Manifesto is one of the companies that's really trying to promote the indie developer of any persuasion, no matter kind of how niche their game, or how relatively, or well, according to yesterday, how relatively unplayable they are. So I appreciate that you're promoting those games. And finally, on the end, we have Mark Morris from Introversion Software, who were, of course, the grand prize winners at the IGF last year with Darwinia, and are also doing DEF CON and Multicon and GigaCon and any numbers of extensions of their franchises with crazy names. So well, firstly, I guess I'm going to read out the one paragraph version of this panel so you can see the kind of insane greatness that we're planning for and aren't possibly going to reach. So it says, in a much more wide-ranging discussion, we look at the next 2, 5 or even 10 years for the independent games movement. How will the opportunities to make a living change? Where is innovation going to come from, and how? And why is it a particularly good or indeed bad time to be an indie game creator? So that's a bit of a big subject, but I have some questions which will hopefully subdivide that a bit. And the first thing I really wanted to ask you guys, maybe starting with Mark, is do you think we're getting to the stage where there's a tipping point, and it's significantly more easier to make a living as an indie creator? And how does that compare to like 2 or 3 years ago, and how is that going to compare to 2 or 3 years or even 5 years' time?
Yeah, sure. I think it is a lot easier now than it was, well, like you say, certainly 2 or 3 years ago to break into the sector. I mean, really, it's the internet that provides the direct link between you as a developer and the potential, the enormous gaming market which is out there. We built our company on the premise that we were going to deliver an online distribution system, write one, and then sell our games to anyone that would come directly to us. And ever since we started Introversion, we've always carried on with that particular methodology. And every publishing deal that we sign with any of the big guys, we always make sure that we retain the rights to sell directly to our own end users, because it really is our lifeblood. So whenever we hit any of the problems that every developer hits with publishers, milestones, bankruptcies, offsetting one product against another product, all the pitfalls that you fall into, we're okay because we've got this feed kind of constantly coming back to us. Now, back when we sort of started, the console market was the one that we really wanted to crack and get into, because of course as a gamer, or as a developer rather, PC is quite easy. It's there, it's sat in everyone's bedroom or living room, whatever you want to do, but to really establish yourselves you need to be on the consoles. But a few years ago it just wasn't possible. You needed to pay the advance on royalties for the production of all your units and these sorts of things that if you were small you just couldn't afford to do. So you had to sign your life away to a publisher. You had no choice about it. But recently with PSN and also Xbox Live Arcade, we're seeing cheap distribution methodologies which have come out, which enable pretty much anybody that has the sort of wherewithal to write a game and a little bit of business savvy so that they can deal with the console holders, the platform holders, to push their games out over these channels. So I really do think that it's been a change literally over the last sort of 2 years.
Okay. I would agree that things are looking up and things are in fact easier for developers. I will say, however, if you look at kind of the landscape of the games industry, right, there's the conventional market, there's massively multiplayer games, there's casual games, there's mobile games. Independent games is still a pimple on the game industry's ass, right? So we're a long way from this seeing the kind of land rush that we've seen into independent games and into casual games. And if any of you are really contemplating quitting your day job in order to devote yourself full time to being an independent game developer, I would advise you not to do that. On the other hand, it is true that there are a lot more opportunities than there used to be, and also true again that there is the potential of console distribution. Although I will point out that Xbox Live Arena is still very much a controlled environment with a relative handful of titles going up there and being supported by Microsoft. So obviously, Introversion has the chops and the credibility and the history to be able to exploit that channel, but a lot of other developers are not going to have that opportunity. But still, things are looking up, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of things have changed in the last few years. Some things that we really take for granted. For example, if you think about 5 years ago, the internet, people were still very reluctant to give out their credit card numbers online. The internet only had its 10th anniversary when? Maybe a year or two ago? Not the internet, the World Wide Web. Is that right? Jonathan Blow's giving me a funny look. All right. But it is true that several years ago, it's only recently that higher bandwidth have made people comfortable doing, that are not sort of hardcore gamers and internet geeks, comfortable downloading megabytes of data. People are more comfortable doing transactions online. There are off-the-shelf solutions for packaging and doing digital rights management for online games. So in terms of distribution, this has helped us. But I also think that I guess it was about 3 or 4 GDCs ago when we really had a change of emphasis too. I mean, we had always thought, Mark, to agree with you, consoles was sort of where we always wanted to be. Okay, we're doing small games now, but eventually we wanted to be working in the real game industry. And something happened. There was an incredible malaise about 3 or 4 GDCs ago, and I remember it was encapsulated in a game design keynote that Warren Spector gave. And Warren is a dear friend of mine and I adore him, but he made a lot of people angry with this talk because it was about licensed games. Mm-hmm. And one of the things he said was, forget about original content. Licensed games make for, wonderful design challenges too. I would love to do a Scooby-Doo game. It was something like that. And I think Greg actually blogged about it.
Kiss the lash that scourges you, right?
And I realized that year, I mean, for me it was kind of a personal moment when I thought, you know what? Why are we aspiring to sort of want to enter into this sort of larger game industry? There's no way that we could do the interesting work, this kind of small-scale work, doing many games a year. The downloadable games and casual games had not yet actually emerged, but we still sensed that that something was going on. So, I think as much as anything, today we kind of take a lot of things for granted, including the sort of notion of independent games as we're talking about them today. But actually, even just a few years ago, it was harder to imagine. I mean, there were far fewer people in the space.
Well, the notion, I should say, independent game has also a phrase that has changed in meaning, because it used to be that any game from an independent developer was an independent game. So, Half-Life 2 would be an independent game. But that's not quite what we mean now when we say indie. It has something more to do with the aesthetic of independent music and independent film, and so.
I'm going to have to disagree with Greg that independent gaming is a pimple on the ass of the game industry.
It's more like a wart on the heel.
No. I think if you think of the game industry as a butt, which I think a lot of people do, but I would say that independent games is one cheek, and the mainstream industry is another cheek. And the reason that independent games seems like a pimple is because, I guess, to carry this analogy to its death, the general public is not wearing the right pants. So I think the purpose of things like IGF and this summit and this panel is really to make the general public put on, and the game industry as a whole, put on the right pants so that we can be two cheeks working as a single butt. That's really the problem, I think, and that's why it's easier to be an independent game developer now than it used to be, is because, you know, we're starting to notice that other cheek, and we're starting to notice that it's hard to walk without that other cheek. And since we're talking about the future, in 30, this mentality of getting onto consoles, breaking into the mainstream industry, and consoles kind of represent the mainstream industry. I don't know if that's really, I don't know if I really see that as being like the ultimate goal for an independent game developer, because I don't know, in 30 years, you know, right now consoles are starting to, you know, do a lot of downloadable content, but really that's just one, you know, it's just really one tiny sort of venue for games, and in 30 years, everything's going to have a game on it, you know. Toasters are going to have downloadable games that you can get for them, and indie games, I think, you know, you can't put Gears of War on a cell phone, but you can put an independently developed, you know, a quote-unquote small game on a cell phone, and you can make it really innovative, you know, if you think about it. People were making really great, innovative games long before, you know, we had huge amounts of processing power and all that, and, you know, in the future games are going to be everywhere, and indie games are especially going to be everywhere, and I think, so I don't know.
But I think from my point of view, I think the consoles are a really good pipe to the kind of people who currently like indie games. It's not even necessarily. The problem is that the PC is not such a. You know, there are all kinds of people all over the internet, and it's difficult for them to find their way to stuff that they might like. So it's not even necessarily that consoles are best suited for indie games, but I suspect it's the demographic of people who buy next-gen consoles who are currently best suited to enjoying independent-styled games that have slightly different kind of gameplay mechanisms or stuff that's not even immediately obvious sometimes.
No, I mean, I think the consoles have been playing a huge part just really recently in kind of bringing, you know, independent games to mainstream audiences and really providing a way for independent game developers to make a living these days, you know. I think it's great, but I don't see that as consoles as kind of being the necessarily the place that indie games.
Sorry, I thought you were going to do the button metaphor again, and I was going to stop you, but you can carry on if you don't talk about that.
Well, look, from my perspective, the existence of downloadable content on consoles is a great thing, and it offers a new venue for, you know, distribution for people. On the other hand, we're still dealing with the same kind of command and control environment with a single gatekeeper, and at the moment, say, Xbox Live Arena is offering very favorable terms in terms of share of the consumer dollar to developers. However, of course, since they are the sole point of distribution, they have a chokehold on that, and as the dollar volume grows, the temptation for them to demand a higher and higher proportion of revenues will increase, as we've seen, say, with the increase in the revenue share that Yahoo demands for casual games. So ultimately, closed platforms are not the path to the future.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I disagree. I'm actually. It's interesting that the console companies are jumping into digital distribution. I don't in any way see that as actually ultimately going to have a huge impact on unleashing, let's say, a kind of creative spirit of innovation within games. The fact is that the people that have Xbox Live are a subset of the people that own Xboxes, that subscribe to the live service, that want to buy a certain kind of game. Whereas just on a global scale, the people with computers connected to the internet, it's so huge. I mean, that's the audience. That's how we're going to reach people.
I mean, it is true that Xbox Live Arena is a great marketing channel because they have the audience that is exactly right for the content they're piping to it. And if you're doing something on the public internet, making people aware of what you're doing is much more difficult. And of course, this is something we struggle with every day, right?
I think the point is, though, that a few years ago we didn't have a choice. We couldn't put an indie game out on the console. Now we can.
Yeah.
So, and it's very much, as you say, that previously you could hold consoles up and say, this is something that we need to be aiming for. But now you can say, well, no, I'm not going to bother putting my game onto Xbox because I don't like controllers. You know, I'm going to write a keyboard and a mouse game. But just at the moment, the opportunity is there. And although I do agree with you that when you look to the future, certainly with what Microsoft are doing at the moment, the terms are very, very favourable, and they may change. You know, eventually we might get to the position where there are so many games on XLA that there'll be some kind of merchandising, or the euphemism that I hear is kind of shelf edge management, and then we're going to kind of go back to square one. So, you know, you're not going to be able to take your title and put it on Xbox. But as always, you know, let's make hay where the sun shines.
Right,
you know, while we can reach, I think the Microsoft announced there are 6 million gamers now on XLA. So, and what are there now, sort of 60-odd games? So if I put one of my games, if I put Darwinia or DEF CON, I'm going to hit 6 million people will see my game, and I can't do that over the internet. I can't generate that kind of traffic. So in terms of
but on the other hand, I think it's great that Introversion you guys have basically stayed away from all of the so-called casual game portals, right? Because they take such a huge portion of revenue. Can we talk about what a fucking ripoff it is that a company they don't have any physical warehousing or storage or display, they don't have customers coming into an actual bricks and mortar store, are taking 60, 70, 80% of every sale? When Apple sells a song in iTunes and they keep 9 cents out of every 99 cents, the record industry is up in arms about how much they're taking. That's 10% share, not 60, 70, 80% share. So anyway, I wish that we had our own distribution network, that we didn't have to go to those portals, but we do. But I applaud you guys for refusing to take part in that system.
It's why we wrote one. It's why we signed up, why we got WorldPay. It's all available. It's why we did it from day one, because why am I bothering to pay somebody for something that I can do myself? You know, Now, we learned a lesson with Steam, because we did everything that Steam did. The problem is Steam have got so many users sat on the other end of it that once again, you know, they do drive traffic for you. But again, excuse me, when we were chatting with Valve, the terms that Valve are offering were brilliant to us. Again, you know, it was balanced, you know, in terms of exactly your point. They weren't asking for like 90% of the game, you know, because if they did, we would have said, see you guys, you know, what are you offering to me? What do you do that I can't do now? And I think at the moment, the publishers, there's some interesting debates that are going to go on about the publisher rant. I want to go and watch this, because I want to ask the question, what do you do now?
I'll be moderating that tomorrow at 9 a.m., ladies and gentlemen.
What does a publisher do now, really? Why do I need them? You know, if I can fund the games myself, why do I need anything that they can offer? I can do it all myself. And that's the message that you know, I say I can do it, but so can every other developer in the world in the, you know, in the independent game arena, and then put their games out over whatever channels, you know, are available.
I mean, it seems to me that it's somewhat about creating funnels, and if you're talking about online, you know, all of these larger aggregators are creating large funnels, and then you pay to appear on the funnel. And my slight concern is that is it possible to build your own funnel that is big enough, or do you just have to distribute yourself over multiple funnels?
Does the funnel metaphor fit into the ass cheeks? I'm just trying to put all that together in my
curses.
head.
I've been tripped up by my own metaphor, but yeah,
everything fits into that metaphor, I think.
but no, seriously,
through the funnel, I think.
You know, the thing is, it's very easy to make a deal with Yahoo. They've got huge amounts of traffic. They stick something up there. It's going to sell a certain amount of content. To get that same level of traffic yourself is a huge marketing challenge, right? And marketing is not necessarily the core competence for most developers. So can you do it yourself? Yeah. But it's, you know, it's kind of, it's the path of least resistance, I guess. But.
Why can't developers, you know, instead of having a developer doing it, you know, him or herself, why couldn't developers, you know, do it themselves together? I mean, the idea of a developer-owned portal to me sounds really nice, because developers understand what developers want. You know, I mean, the problem with the publisher-developer kind of, I mean, it's not like, it's like a parasitic relationship, right? Because what the publisher wants is different from what the developer wants, but...
Yeah. This is actually something I thought about before founding Manifesto Games. Is there a way to do it as a kind of consortium of developers, either a nonprofit organization or, you know, as something? And I just couldn't figure out how to make it happen. You know, I would be perfectly happy with that rather than trying to run Manifesto as a profit-making enterprise.
It's interesting, because in my experience, I've seen that independent developers who have not made it are very much more interested in working together and helping each other out than independent developers that have kind of, you know, are on the road to success. In a way, I feel like but it's the independent developers who are kind of making it who have the most sort of, the most clout, the most ability to kind of help other developers out. I don't know. It's
well, Simon, you probably know more about this than me, but is the independent game SIG at the IGDA doing anything to maybe establish a set of standards and guidelines? For example, here's what we think is the fair proportion of what a game portal distribution point doing this amount of work should give to a developer. I mean, I think partially it's the role of the IGDA to maybe establish some standards for fair practices and say, so then a developer can go to a portal or a distribution place and say, what do you mean you want to take 75% of every sale? The IGDA, has said that.
And they can say, we're Yahoo, and you're not.
Right, but at least that's the start of something, right? It's a creation of some kind of standards.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happening is, in most cases, obviously independent versus casual is a big issue, but the casual game SIG is certainly making a lot of progress in doing a bunch of things. But what I see the casual game companies doing, as far as I can see, is everyone is becoming aggregators as well as doing their own stuff. And,
right.
and that seems to be like Reflexive, for example, who we were referencing earlier. But that's clearly not a one-size-fits-all solution. And in some ways, I still find it a little odd when I go to an independent developer site and they have like 10 games on there and only one is theirs. Right. It just seems a little bit. I mean, maybe that's the best business model, but it seems a little bit odd to me. So I don't know. I feel like some indie developers are going that way a little bit already, and it probably is a better way. If you can get a fan base for your site, then people will buy other games that you've recommended. Like I think Chronic Logic do this. There's a bunch of games on their site that aren't actually done directly by them. So yeah. I mean, I guess that's kind of like a really small version of what you're talking about, Derek. It's just informal.
Yeah. I mean I never really understood that. It's confusing because I think as a developer, you have your own personal website, and then you have kind of a bunch of other games from other people. It gets confusing. I think what really needs, a developer-owned portal where you know that every game on that portal is going to be of a certain quality. That, to me, sounds like a really good thing. Because the problem right now is that, people want to play a good indie game. They don't really know what that... they don't really know where to go to get something like that exactly. It's very, the indie game community is just very, I feel like it's very different. I think everyone here and everyone who's kind of in the scene is very aware of what's going on, which games are doing well, which games are good, but I think it's difficult for an outsider to kind of...
I think that there actually is room. Ooh, look at that. I successfully jumped in before Greg Costikyan. I think that there is room for the creation of kind of successful medium-stage portals. If you look at some of the medium-sized portals, even though they're casual game portals, but like Big Fish and iWin, they're not really that old. I mean, they jumped in, they marketed the shit out of themselves. They tried to make connections with every other big portal and drive traffic to their sites. And it's true that what they're putting on there is a kind of typical vanilla casual game fare, including a lot of Gamelab games, so I'm not excluding ourselves from that statement. But the fact is that they are actually pretty successful businesses at this point. I think there is room for someone to take a very different tack, not go for the so-called casual game audience, which people identify as 30-something, 40-something female Midwestern housewives, which is a term that's used in the industry, and instead, go for a different audience, which is exactly what Manifesto Games is trying to do.
I was about to say you just described my business plan.
But I think that there is room for multiple people doing that. I think the games are there. I think the audience is there.
Oh, I would actually love for someone else serious to be doing this because then I could tell the venture capitalists that, this is a hot area. There's other people moving into it. And it's, give me money.
Yeah, I know. It's interesting that, isn't it interesting that kind of all we've been talking about is sort of these distribution and business issues. I do feel like when we're talking about independent games, there's, on the one hand, we talk about what we do, the design processes, the products that we're making, the process we go through, how we keep the company going. And then on the other hand, there's this huge problem of how do we get those things to our consumers? How do we distribute it? How do we make our businesses sustainable?
Yeah. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the big problem right now is exposure because there are so many good interesting games already being made, and I think with sites like Manifesto games, which is absolutely the best attempt so far to do something that's portal and indie. I think the problem you have to a certain extent is that there are so many niches that you just I'm sure, Greg, you've thought about this. It ends up being a collection of niches if you're not careful, and there's nothing to hook. I don't know how you hook people into the concept that there are games that are somewhat more. I guess there are some bridging games. You can argue that Diner Dash, for an example, is a bridging game that has somewhat more complex game mechanics than the average swap two jewels around style game.
Listen, from my perspective, there are kind of two groups of people we're trying to reach and not necessarily doing them terribly well. One of them is PC gamers who are dissatisfied with what they're seeing at GameStop, either because they're old adventure game fans or something of the kind, and they're just not seeing the content they want because it's all Xbox ports. And the other is people who are genuinely kind of bored with the sameness of the product that's out there and are looking for something innovative. I think the proportion of actual gamers who've woken up to the fact that there is this thing called indie games, is tiny. And that's, there's a huge potential audience out there that could be interested in what we're doing.
So what's the hook? I think that's the trouble.
I'm going to step in and say the hook are things like XLA. Because you're going to have the mainstream gamers out there playing the big games, and they're going to hit a button, and they're going to come up, and they're going to see another 10, 11 games that, exactly as you just described, games that no one's seen before, that are kind of interesting, new ideas, new takes on things, and they're going to think, actually, wow, there are more genres, different games, and I don't need to play another first-person shooter. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's going to be the hook. Yep. Certainly in the next kind of year or a couple of years, until, as you say, it all goes peaked on.
Well, the other approach is what we're seeing some companies like Congregate do, which is, and I'm about to use a phrase which I'm sure is in at least 100 business plans right now, be a YouTube of games, right? So the idea of people uploading games and sharing them and rating them and somehow also monetizing them. But I actually saw Congregate present its kind of beta site at the Casual Games Conference in Amsterdam, and I was pretty impressed. I actually think they're going about it in a pretty smart way. And there's other sites that are doing similar things that are a different approach than Manifesto, which is more of a top-down editorial approach. But there's possibly something there as well.
Yeah, no, I think one of the big problems we have is the sites like Newgrounds.com, and Newgrounds has just a bunch of really interesting games on it, and they're all done by the users, and they're all completely free to play, and everyone made them for free. So the question really is, certainly when you're competing on the internet on the PC, it's not like independent film. You can't have a star to differentiate yourself. So how do you really differentiate yourselves from all those really cool kids who are actually doing games which are better and aren't at school, so they don't care about making money out of it? So
I think those kids that are doing games for free are honestly, they're like the lifeblood of the indie community. And it's good. I saw a panel yesterday called Innovation in Indie Games that had Genova Chen and John Mack and John Blow on it, and John Blow's in his presentation, he had this diagram that I really liked because to me it was very visual and it kind of looked like a game. It showed kind of the total space of what games can be, and then it showed what we're actually doing as being this tiny little island in this giant sea of possibilities, right? And he kind of showed that in order to expand that, space, we need to, kind of just keep pushing the boundaries of what we can do. And as independent developers, we can really do that, right? Because we can do whatever we want, basically. I see that as being almost like godlike power. It's like being a superhero is being an independent developer.
Yeah,
what was interesting was that everyone on that panel had I felt like they all wanted to expand that space, but they had very different ideas about how to do that. Kyle, for example, his idea or his kind of methodology was just to make 100 games and then just kind of expand that space by just kind of shooting in every direction. Genova was very insistent on kind of picking a direction and then just kind of following that direction. And his idea was to be very focused about what you do. But generally, they all really had the same kind of goal, which I think was great. And I think really the indie game industry needs all all 4 of those guys in it, and it needs, lots of different people.
Well, let me ask you guys a question. Raise your hand if you're here at this session or in the game industry because you're interested in making new kinds of games in some way. All right? That's why we're here. I think you're absolutely right in that everyone here is going to have a different answer to that question. What's their process? What's motivating? They want to tell a new kind of story. They want to do a new kind of interaction. They want to, they want to spank a new kind of ass or whatever you want to put it. So that,
there's so many asses out there just waiting to get spanked in the ocean of.
I look at it. I see a sea of asses. No, wait, that sounded like it wasn't nice.
But the thing about the point I was trying to make that I kind of went off on a tangent about was, freeware developers are essential because when money is not involved, you do whatever the hell you want.
And I think that's a great point. But one of the things I've noticed is, the IGF is in its 9th year now. And if we're just having the discussion now about the independent game scene getting on its feet from a financial point of view, then, in previous years, there have been a lot of hobbyist developers who enter and such like.
I don't see hobbyist developers as being a competition for developers who spend, who work full-time. Because if you're a hobbyist, that means you're working, in your free time. Like you take a really excellent free game like Cave Story, right? Made by the Japanese developer Pixel. And that game is awesome. It is on par with, people would pay money for that. But a game like, it took him 5 years because he's a hobbyist developer. So, and the thing is, if someone made a game like that and charged money for it, just because that game exists does not mean people don't want to pay money for another game. And because if you are trying to make a similar game, let's say, but you're working at it full time, I don't know. You can do a lot more. So I just I see the freeware developers as kind of expanding, doing a great job of expanding that kind of island that we're on right now.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point because it is true they don't have the time. Like if you're someone who's working in your spare time, you probably won't have the time to do it. I think one of the reasons we've seen such a increase in quality in the IGF entries recently is people are just starting to have more time to work on their games, and I think that makes
the other thing is that a lot I start out free. But
Greg is flapping his mouth. Please speak.
No, actually, there is one thing I wanted to say, which I think it's wrong to confuse somebody who works full-time with someone who is professional. So, for example, almost all of the professionally published science fiction writers I know have day jobs because it's very hard to make a living writing science fiction. And in many cases, I view the people who are doing free stuff as potential sources of talent. I mean, Dave Gilbert's first version of the Shiva was free. And it got a lot of response, and he went back and he did voice acting and improved the quality of the game and released it as a commercial product. That's great. And I also don't view it as competition. We have a game on our site which is open source freeware game called Battle for Wesnoth, turn-based fantasy, turn-based strategy game. We get a lot of people who come to our site looking for that game, download it, and then come back and buy commercial turn-based games from us. So this is all good.
But, the question of making a living doing this is important. There's a certain kind of game that you can make as a sort of lone wolf developer or working with two other people in your spare time. There's also a kind of medium-sized game where that requires a real company. I mean, that's sort of what Introversion is doing, what Gamelab is doing. Our games take, 6, 9, 10, 12 months to make, and think about similar for you guys, maybe a little more.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of money. I mean, I think that it's great. There's a whole spectrum of indie game developers that we need to have, from people uploading games to Newgrounds for free, but also up through companies that can sustain themselves as commercial entities where you have this sort of dedicated teams that are there every day getting salaries. And it's really hard. I mean, it's actually very hard to sustain a company like Gamelab, but we've managed to survive. But I'm sure it's a struggle for you guys too.
Yeah.
So why do you think it is that so few independent game companies do what Gamelab does and sort of do? Because I invited you to speak because you're sort of bridging the casual indie gap. I know it's all very notional, but is
that the third ass cheek, the casual ass cheek?
The metaphor again. But yeah, I mean,
like a tube sock.
I mean, it's interesting to me, and and I actually see some of the Gamelab titles, and I can see some of them almost seem to me to be too sophisticated to be casual games. I don't know if that's I don't know if that's a horribly prejudicial thing for me to say, but so why do you think like more companies are not trying to kind of bridge that gap, or are they and we don't notice?
Eric probably won't say this, but utter lack of imagination among most casual game developers.
That's a good answer, and they're all next door, so they can't really hear us. Apart from Eric.
I think that creatively, as I mentioned in my talk, casual games are a little bit in a tailspin. I think that there's been a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy where there's a little bit of conservatism on the part of publishers, and a lot of developers that I know starting new companies wanted to say, okay, well, we want to do this very innovative stuff. Our first game, we're going to play it safe and do a kind of standard match 3 title. Right. And then suddenly there's a huge glut of those. Now, what's interesting is that at the publishers panel at the Casual Game Summit, it was reported to me over lunch today, actually all the publishers are saying, we want innovative titles. We don't want to see more match 3 games.
Every publisher in the conventional game industry, you get them on a panel, they're going to say, we want innovation. But, they don't actually mean it.
No.
Right?
Perhaps. I'm not a publisher, so I can't verify that statement.
I mean, there's a lack of imagination, I think, in the game industry as a whole. You can't say that there's a lack of imagination in the casual sector or in the indie sector, it's everywhere. And
you know what? I don't think there's a lack of imagination. I just think making good games is really fucking hard.
It is.
I mean, there's a lot of it's really hard, and so people, it's often we'll do consulting for someone who wants to do some kind of serious educational game, and it's Myst plus Civilization plus Quake, right? And they have no idea how huge and ambitious their project is. And what I tell them is that if you got a game development team and all you wanted to do was clone Bejeweled and put a little twist on it, make it a little bit different, but basically do the same game, doing that well is hard. All the craft of game design, all the craft of player experience, making sure that they know that when you match 3, that then the bonus lights up over the center of where they clicked and stays on just long enough for them to register but not obscure the thing that's underneath, which is falling down, right? All those little tiny timing things, visual things, the semiotics of making them understand what their mouse click meant, that stuff is really hard. So I mean, I want to challenge game developers to do better, but I also think that taking on new subject matters, inventing new forms of interactivity, playing with aesthetics and sound, trying to bring in influences from outside games into the culture of games, that shit is really hard. So in that sense, I don't want to bash game developers like, oh, there's a handful of truly creative people and everyone else is sitting on their asses. I think everyone here in this room probably thinks really hard about making new games and really wants to make innovative games. It's just that shit is really, really hard to do. So anyway, I don't mean to interrupt you, but
I misphrased it because I think the imagination is totally there. It's more about, how do you bring that imagination out? Because everyone is creative. Everyone has these great ideas. They're just not coming out. They're not.
Well, I think from my point of view, that the most interesting games in the Independent Games Festival this year have been based, I would say, more on influences and kind of iteration than on innovation. Some of the best indie games I can think of, I can think which 2 or 3 games they've played and loved to make that game. And there was, the most eye-opening session was probably the one where innovation and gimmick were, conflated. People don't really consider that, there's a danger. You just go, innovation is great, but clearly there's a whole bunch of ways where iteration is actually by far the best thing to do. And one of the things I get most excited about in indie titles actually, and I feel like there's a whole bunch of genres which have fallen out of the mainstream that are falling kind of back in via indie. So I don't know. Have you guys got particular styles or genres that you think are coming back?
Well, I just wanted to say that I think there's this huge emphasis on innovation in, especially for independent games, and I think that's kind of been like the rallying cry of the independent game community is like innovation, and then no one really understands what that means. And
it means doing something that hasn't been done before. That's what it means, and it's that simple. It's as simple as that. I mean, it's a very hard thing to achieve, but it means,
apparently Mark knows
wow,
what
I've
it
never
means,
seen that game before.
Well, there you go. I wish someone had told me that before this panel started.
But I'd agree with that, but there are a lot of different ways to do that. For example, a real-time strategy game, resource extraction, building construction, real-time combat. All of these elements had been in games previously. It's just that before Dune 2, no one had really brought it together and shown how this fruitful combination of mechanics was really cool and interesting. So in a sense, that was a very innovative game, but in another sense, it's just a collection of mechanics from previous games. So
I found the panel on innovation interesting because it seemed that the consensus was that innovation was not necessarily the banner, the rallying cry for independent games anymore, but I think that what was meant by innovation on that panel was sort of radical formal innovation. Formal meaning the form of the game, the actual interactive mechanics or the logic of the game. And instead people were talking about innovation on the realm of player emotion and experience, expressivity of the player through the interactive mechanics which aren't necessarily innovative, or even the themes or aesthetics of the game being new. So I do think that innovation is important, and I think, Martin, that's a good way to think about it. But I also think that it's interesting that this kind of radical, totally reinventing everything that we know about what a game can be is not necessarily the most important thing anymore.
I think the best example of this innovation for innovation's sake, and I don't mean to pick on it, there was a game that was entered in the IGF this year or last year, which was a kind of maze labyrinth style game, and the innovation was they had 4 different windows for 4 different perspectives, and those windows moved around the screen while you played the game. So I think that's really like the best example I can think of, where if you make a conscious effort to say, hey guys, I'm going to do something completely different, then you'll end up with 4 camera windows moving around the screen. So I mean, it seems to me that,
you know what? Just to pipe in. But the thing is that there really needs to be room for all of that stuff. The fact is that early electronic music experiments from the 60s and 70s are probably unlistenable to today's audiences.
Right.
But it's those experiments that then led to kind of German industrial music, which led to British electronic music, and at some point, maybe the Chemical Brothers, there was a sort of tipping point, and electronica moved out of just sort of techno clubs and into mainstream music, and now it's completely infused it. Now other things are sort of popping up along the margins. I mean, and so that's why things like the IGF are important, things like Newgrounds are important. The most important thing is that we have a kind of cultural ecosystem with games that's rich and robust enough to support all different sort of kinds of life. Right? Big, huge, hulking corporate monsters, as well as like strange little hybrid, bizarre creatures that are only going to live for a little while. No one wants to look at them anyway, but they may die and fertilize something else, with their corpse. So I think that weird, bizarre games like that are really interesting and important. And there's all sort of pieces to the puzzle. It has to do with people writing about games in a more sophisticated way. It has to do with the distribution questions. It has to do with people being educated in games. A lot of the great stuff we're seeing now are from students, right? Which I think is fantastic. So even and in that sense, even sort of academic game design theory, which is what I indulge in sometimes, is also an important part of that picture in terms of educating students and making them think about games before they're sort of unleashed into the industry.
So there's some people who want to make comments. So I think we'll go ahead and do that now. And so this is kind of Q&A stroke continuing the session.
Thanks, Simon. I just wanted to get back to the future. About tools. This is something also that occurred over the last 5 to 10 years, was the tool set available to independent developers became very powerful. And I think that actually opened up a lot more of what people can do and more people who could do it.
Yep.
And I just wanted to see if you express on that axis how you see the future evolve as far as tools going, because it's really been great for me.
Our opinion on whether tools have benefited the...
No, what are they going to do in the future? I mean...
I guess the question is, how are tools going to make games better in the indie space?
Oh, well, I see I see tools as being, I see ideas as being the most important thing, and tools are I think.
Tools are enablers. They allow more people to express themselves.
Right,
okay?
and that's a good thing, because the more people that can make games, the more, the more games that get made, the more potentially good games get made. I mean, Eric was saying that, making a good game is very difficult.
I think I said it was fucking difficult. I didn't mean to correct you.
I mean, we carry a whole series of games that are built using Adventure Game Studio or RPG Maker or Game Maker.
And those are more or less
for that matter, which is a tool in a different sense. And that's all cool, and it's great, and it's also useful because it allows people who don't necessarily have the ability to program in C++ and get down to the hardware level to do this kind of thing. And that's fantastic. As far as how tools evolve, I got no clue.
I mean, I want someone who's not a game maker, who's not, I want someone who's not a game maker to make a game. That is a game I would love to play.
But
someone
you know
who
what?
Doesn't play games.
That happens.
Super Columbine Massacre RPG was made by someone who really came from a filmmaking background, used RPG Maker, did not innovate in the sense of formal innovation, right? You're not going to find a new way to click on something, or you're not going to innovate in the interactive sense in RPG Maker, but they innovated by creating a documentary in game form, which is quite brilliant in a lot of ways. So, I think tools constrain as much as they liberate.
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
So
I'm just hoping that they evolve to unconstrain and offer more opportunity to developers at that level who don't necessarily want to go down and write their own physics engine,
I think it'll just change the nature of the games that are coming out of the indie sector. We've sort of spoken about microevolution or macroevolution, microevolution, small changes in one particular direction. And when you're using tools, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing the same thing that you've seen before used in a slightly different way. So there'll be a kind of a general increase in quality, but you won't notice because there'll be the increase in quality across the whole board because everyone's using the tools.
So far you've been focusing on, I should let the other people talk, been focusing on the very specific tools like RPG Maker and Game Maker. And so, I personally use Python Pygame, which is very open-ended, that lets me do anything. I'm not restricted. But that tool set allows me to be more efficient than I ever was when I was programming C++, for 10 years. It's like I'm in heaven. I want to see more of that sort of openness, but more power. And I'm hoping that we'll see more tools in the future that allow more people to have that sort of expressiveness.
Yeah.
Cool. Next.
Question about the near future for people not named Greg. Because Greg opened up by saying if you were considering quitting your day job to start being an indie programmer today, he would recommend against that. And I'd like to hear what the other three panelists think about that.
Shall I start with that? Because when we first started making Uplink a few years ago, we were literally getting the bubble jet printers out and printing the jackets and putting CDs and sending them out to the World Wide Web via a system that we bought. Now you walk in downstairs, and sorry for sort of patting myself on the back, but there's a massive fuck off banner of me, at the IGF. Now, if I can do it, you lot can all do it. So, I would really say to you, don't listen to him at all. I don't know who this guy is. There is an enormous market out there. It's getting easier day by day. If you want to do it, that show of hands was phenomenal. Earlier, who wants to make different games? Now, I could ask a similar question: how many people are working for game developers at the moment and are being constrained on a daily basis by the publisher? How many hands are we going to see there?
That's
how many
one.
people aren't allowed to make the games? One, good.
Right.
But yeah, no, do it, quit.
One of the things that I neglected to say during my talk is that one of my best advice for people that want to strike it out on their own is work in the industry for a while. I worked in the industry for 6 years before starting Gamelab 7 years ago, and that experience was invaluable. People graduate from school or have a year or two in the industry. Everyone has the same kind of idealism. I did too. I thought the system was fucked. I thought I could do better. I thought that just pure creativity would be rewarded. It's true. You have to really hustle the system. You have to work the system. You have to have an idea of how you're going to actually make this work from a business point of view. So I think that there are growing opportunities, but you have to be really smart. Who you work with, the kind of path that you're going down. Just to drop out and make a game that you think is cool and then hope somehow to figure out how to make money from it, you shouldn't do. But I think that increasingly there are ways to be a self-supporting indie game developer.
I'm going to sort of carry on my trend of disagreeing with everyone down the panel and say that actually in a lot of cases I see developers who have spent a lot of time in the industry and they start start accepting things. You know, they start accepting the rough end of the deal. They go, you only get 30% from publishers. That's what you get. You know, but if you step back and think about what services are they providing in a more idealistic sense, then when you go in, you start saying, well, look, no, I'm going to keep 70%, and if you don't like it, I'm going to find a different way. So, of course, experience is always very helpful, but at the same time, sometimes it can hold you back if you're not thinking about what's actually going on here. You know, stop and take a sort of wider look at the industry. And I think that it's always a balance, but we didn't know our ass from our elbow when we started.
Which ass cheek was that?
I don't know. That was the casual ass cheek.
Just as an example.
I can't believe I've drawn into that metaphor. I was trying so hard to just maintain some standard of dignity, and I got sucked in. That's what happens with experience.
But to give an example from my own experience, I graduated from Berkeley with a computer science degree, not really sure what I was going to do with it, and as soon as I graduated, I didn't program a single computer. I spent a year just drawing, honestly, and then it was after that year of drawing that I met up with Alec, who's the other team member on Blot, and we started working on a query, and we just started doing it. And I'm not, and we have yet to see whether we are going to be successful with that game. But things are pretty encouraging, and I didn't spend a single second in the game industry. So I don't think it's necessary.
So I guess what people are telling you is do whatever they did, but what we did differ. So how can you decide?
I will say, in my experience in life in general, the best thing to do is follow your bliss. So, yeah, don't quit your day. When I say don't quit your day job, I mean this is not gold rush territory, guys. The number of people who are going to get rich doing independent games in the next 5 years, anyway, I will be very surprised if you can count it on the fingers of one hand. All right, if you're going to do this, you should do it because you can do nothing else. Because this is what you have to do. All right, and besides which, hey. Programming nights and weekends, right? Do you necessarily have to quit your day job in order to do this?
That's actually a very good point. Do it because you have to, because we're talking about innovation. Now, the thing is, when you're not receiving any money because you've sort of jumped in and there is no other source of income, you will finish the game. You will, because if you don't, there's no more money that's coming in. Yeah. And when you decide that you want to be an independent games company, you have to accept all of the ride that's going to go with it. The times when you're not going to be able to afford your mortgage payments and all the rest of it. And that's the same for any entrepreneur. You don't get rich quick. What you do is you suffer for a long, long time. And if you're not if you're not prepared to suffer, then no, I would keep working for EA or something.
So the message is you have to suffer.
You have to suffer for your ideas, right?
Next.
What about the marketing?
Marketing. Yeah, marketing's, well, coming back to sort of what we were talking about on the web earlier on, we've spent at Introversion a total of about $20,000 in our entire 5 years on advertising. The rest of what we do is PR. We have a massive public relations campaign. Now, what this means is that there are so many sites over the internet that will review your game and drive traffic straight towards you. If you caught the press, and I don't mean caught the press by sending them gifts and things. But if you find out who is important, go down and see them, make friends with them, because they've got the same passion about the games that you've got. Then they'll write about you, and they'll write about you a lot. Say interesting things, swear a lot. That gets you coverage. And when you do these things, you'll find yourself all over the place, and then the traffic will come to you. But what you have to remember is you have to have your own mechanism to exploit that traffic. The conversation we had at the start of this panel was, you need to have a way from your own website that you're going to sell these games, even if it's via some kind of third party. But you need to do something with all the work that you're doing to let everyone in the world know about your games. And also, you've got to get out there all the time. You've got to speak on panels. You've got to be everywhere. So it's almost worth having someone in your team kind of devoted that's not a kind of typically introspective developer who hates getting up and giving presentations. You've got to have some loudmouthed idiot that that you can wheel up on stage just to kind of be offensive.
Right. I mean, that's exactly what I meant in my presentation about being an honest hustler, hustling the company. Right. And I think Introversion is a great example of a company that's hustles itself very well to the press, to the indie community,
and incidentally do a web search for Kieran Gillen's article about how he discovered their first game. It's written from a journalist's perspective, but it's a pretty good series of ideas for how to go about doing PR for an independent game. So.
Yeah, definitely. Kieran wrote a kind of 8-piece thing on case study on us on how we did it well, and we didn't know what we were doing. This comes back to what we were saying before. We didn't have a clue what to do. We just sat down and thought, if I was a magazine journalist, what would I want? And then we thought, well, we'd want a curry, so we went down and bought them all a curry. It worked.
It seems like people like Kieran are few and far between, though, and most of the people who are reviewing games don't take a very critical eye that you really need for something that's really innovative. How long do you think it will take for people like that to become more numerous in games journalism and to disseminate to the major outlets?
I actually think that most reviewers of games are actually some of the best and are open to reviewing things because they're so bored of writing the same review. It's like, Battlefield 8, see my review of Battlefield 1. There's nothing different. So actually, most of the people, most of the games journalists and press actually really are interested. And also, they're very keen they want to support the industry a lot, I think. So even if they might not necessarily like your game, they're going to give you some coverage and say, this is crap, but kind of buy it anyway, because we need to support these people. So I'd actually disagree and think that most of the journalists that I've met are actually deeply compassionate and passionate about the industry and are more likely to not treat you gently because they've got to, they've got to be truthful to their readers, but just kind of make sure that they're kind of helping you along a bit.
I think from my point of view, there is a bit of a barrier, though, which is a retail game. If you look at the big sites, you sort of kind of have to be in a box. There's very few games. I think Gish got a GameSpot review, as I recall, but there's very few independent games that get reviewed on GameSpot and IGN, and that's kind of a mechanical thing, I think, and I don't quite understand how that changes.
I think an advantage that independent developers have when marketing is that you can be personal, a mainstream game doesn't really have that kind of opportunity. We got, all kinds of lawyers and PR and all that. But, when you're making an indie game, you can be very personal. You can really kind of, I think people really do want to support. People like knowing that by buying a good product, they're also supporting a real person who's behind that product. And especially on the internet, it's. I think you can really kind of take advantage of that kind of mentality and that advantage that So
cool. Over there.
Listening to all the innovation talk, it got me thinking because I'm a programmer and an artist, both undergrad degrees, and I'm starting to wonder maybe are we asking the wrong question? I know I personally think a lot about what am I going to innovate, what's going to be different, but like they say, if you're thinking outside the box, you're thinking about the box. And I don't think Spike Lee was wondering how he was going to be different when he made his first film, and I don't think.
No, don't think about being different. I
don't think James Joyce was thinking about how he's going to be different when he wrote.
I've got another great analogy here, and it has nothing to do with body parts, but I see. From my kind of schooling experience, I saw that it was kind of, in high school, everyone wants to be the same. You want to join a clique, you want to be very cliquey. And then you go to college and everyone wants to be different. All of a sudden, everyone wants to be different. But then everyone becomes different in a similar direction because they're all running away from the same thing and they end up running in the same direction together. So you end up, I think, the idea is just be yourself. Always, it's.
I agree, and it comes back to sort of what you were saying before about the idea being the important thing, which is very, very difficult because you shouldn't sit down and think, right, I'm going to design a new, different game. You should have a concept for a game in your mind that comes from somewhere, and hopefully you want to kind of foster a kind of area of your brain that will allow new ideas that come in. So those ideas that come in that you end up writing aren't a rehash of something that's been done before. So however you find that place, that space to say, right, I'm going to make, I've just got this crazy idea for a game. I don't know how it's going to work yet, but it's just up there, and then you start sort of moving forward. But it's very difficult to say, go and be different or be creative. You can't really do it. Everyone finds their own way of conceiving of these ideas and then drawing them into the real world.
Do you think there's something different fundamentally about the gaming medium as opposed to film, or do you think maybe it's just our collective personalities?
I think part of the issue is that game design is very difficult because it's incredibly technical as well. You've got to be an engineer, and is also very expensive. So putting a film together, I'm not saying it's cheap, but you can generally do, you know, bits and pieces. You can run around with a camera or whatever and put something together. But it's the fusion of the engineering and the gaming which I think is very difficult, and that's what makes this industry particularly hard.
Just to disagree, I don't think there's anything wrong with intentionally being different. We generate dozens and dozens, hundreds of ideas for games at Gamelab. A lot of them are good ideas, but we say, you know what, this is not a Gamelab game. It's not presenting something new to the player in terms of content and theme, or in terms of interactivity and game logic, or in terms of aesthetics and emotional experience. And we have a filter where we say this game is not distinctive enough, it's not different enough from other games that have been invented. So, you know, I guess we do pursue ideas that are different for difference's sake.
And I'm afraid that we're out of time, so I would like to thank the panelists for coming.
Indie games, yeah!
Whoa, scary.